Iran said the Strait of Hormuz would not reopen until Lebanon was fixed. That was the sentence designed to shake the world. Not a missile launch. Not a naval battle. A sentence. May. And yet that sentence moved through oil markets, shipping desks, diplomatic rooms, and military command centers like a flare fired over a dark sea. Now pause there. May. Because the question is not whether Iran literally locked the Strait of Hormuz like a gate across a harbor. The question is more dangerous than that. Did Iran make the world behave as if the gate might be closing? That is where the official story begins to crack. Reuters reported that Iran's Tasnim news agency, citing a source close to Iran's negotiating team, said Hormuz would not reopen until a ceasefire in Lebanon was respected. The same report said Iran also linked reopening the waterway to waivers for selling Iranian oil. Look at the timing. This was not said in isolation. It came as high-level U.S.-Iran talks were moving through Switzerland, with Qatar and Pakistan trying to keep a fragile diplomatic track alive. The public language was calm enough: talks, mechanisms, roadmap, ceasefire, safe passage, technical discussions. But beneath that calm language, Iran had just done something much bigger than threaten a waterway. Iran brought Lebanon into the talks. And that may have been the mistake. Because Lebanon is not just a battlefield. Lebanon is a trapdoor. Once Iran connected southern Lebanon, Hezbollah, Israeli strikes, oil waivers, and Hormuz into one package, the negotiation stopped being about one crisis. It became a machine with too many moving parts, too many actors, and too many ways to break. Here is the part they do not want to explain. If Iran wanted leverage, it already had several cards: uranium, sanctions relief, frozen assets, oil exports, militia networks, regional pressure. But by tying Hormuz to Lebanon, Tehran took a regional conflict and placed it against the throat of the global economy. That changes how everyone sees the move. This may look like resistance. Inside the global market, it looks like coercion. And once the market sees coercion, diplomacy becomes harder to sell. The public story says Iran was reacting to Israeli strikes in Lebanon. The Guardian reported that Iran said it was closing the Strait of Hormuz after renewed Israeli strikes in southern Lebanon, and that Iran's Revolutionary Guards warned ships not to approach the waterway. That is the surface. But the surface is never enough. The deeper question is this: why would Iran attach Lebanon to Hormuz at the exact moment talks were supposed to create a 60-day path toward a broader deal? The answer is not emotion. The answer is leverage. But leverage has a strange quality. When used carefully, it bends the room. When used too loudly, it exposes your desperation. Follow the money, then follow the fear. Hormuz is not just a narrow waterway. It is the valve on a giant bloodstream. Energy Information Administration data has placed flows through Hormuz at around 20 million barrels per day, roughly 1/5 of global petroleum liquids consumption. That means a threat there is not local. It is planetary. It touches gasoline prices, shipping insurance, Asian importers, European inflation fears, Gulf producers, LNG cargoes, and every government that has to explain to its voters why energy costs suddenly moved. Iran knows this. Washington knows this. Riyadh knows this. Doha knows this. Beijing knows this. And that is why one sentence from Tehran could become bigger than the battlefield that supposedly triggered it. But now comes the contradiction. CENTCOM said commercial vessels continued flowing through an open Strait of Hormuz. It said dozens of merchant ships had transited, carrying more than 17 million barrels of oil to global markets. That matters. Because if ships are still moving, then Iran's claim is not a simple physical closure. It is something else. A pressure signal. A psychological blockade. A threat wrapped in ambiguity. And ambiguity is useful because it lets Iran say two things at once. To its domestic audience and regional partners, it can say, we are defending Lebanon. To international negotiators, it can say, give us terms, or the market gets nervous. But Reuters, citing Kepler data, reported something even more revealing. Shipping through the strait slowed sharply after Iran said it had shut Hormuz again. Only 5 ships moved through on Sunday, down from 26 the day before. That is not theater. That is behavior. And behavior is where geopolitical truth often hides. When governments argue, listen politely. When ships change course, pay attention. Because ships do not care about speeches. Ships respond to risk, insurance, orders, fear, and the cold mathematics of losing a vessel in one of the world's most sensitive choke points. So the real story is not Iran closed Hormuz or Iran failed to close Hormuz. That is too simple. The real story is that Iran created enough uncertainty to slow the system, but not enough certainty to own the consequences. That is a dangerous middle ground. It gives Tehran pressure without full accountability. But it also gives Washington a chance to call the bluff. The U.S. position, as reported publicly, was blunt. Iran does not control the Strait of Hormuz. That sentence is not just a legal claim. It is a strategic counterattack. Washington was not only saying ships can still pass. Washington was saying Iran's main threat is weaker than it looks. On a minus. And this is where bringing Lebanon into the talks may have backfired. On a min. Because before Lebanon entered the package, Iran could frame negotiations around sanctions relief, nuclear limits, oil waivers, and security guarantees. Those are difficult issues, but they are negotiable. They have documents, timelines, verification steps, and diplomatic language. Lebanon is different. Lebanon is not a spreadsheet. Lebanon is a live wire. Israel wants freedom of action against Hezbollah. Hezbollah wants Israeli withdrawal and no deal that leaves Israel free to strike. Iran wants Hezbollah protected as part of its regional deterrent structure. The United States wants a ceasefire mechanism that does not collapse the wider talks. That is not a normal negotiation. On a minus, that is a room full of loaded weapons pretending to be furniture. May reported that Iran wanted the negotiations to include Lebanon and that mechanisms were discussed to keep Hormuz open and enforce a ceasefire in southern Lebanon. That sounds orderly on paper. But paper is where impossible things go to look polite. The problem is simple. Iran can speak for Iran. The United States can speak for the United States. But neither side can completely control Israel, Hezbollah, Gulf shipping behavior, oil traders, or the emotional pressure of domestic politics. That is why Lebanon is such a risky card. It gives Iran moral language. But it also imports uncontrollable actors into the center of the deal. Think of it like adding fire to a contract and then asking everyone to sign calmly. If one Israeli strike happens, Iran can say the ceasefire failed. If one Hezbollah response happens, Israel can say it must act. If shipping slows, markets panic. If markets panic, Washington faces pressure. If Washington faces pressure, threats return. And suddenly the 60-day roadmap is not a roadmap anymore. It is a countdown clock. Look at the timing again. High-level talks in Switzerland were supposed to suggest progress. Reuters reported that mediators said the United States and Iran had agreed to a roadmap toward a final deal within 60 days. Technical talks were expected to continue. There was language about mechanisms, communication lines, safe passage, and Lebanon. That is the public stage. But off-stage, Iran was signaling that Hormuz, oil waivers, and Lebanon were now connected. That is not a coincidence. When a state combines unrelated pressure points, it is usually trying to solve one weakness by activating another strength. Iran's weakness is economic pressure. Sanctions are not a wall. They are a slow tightening belt around the ribs of the state. Oil waivers matter because oil is not just revenue. Oil is oxygen. It pays salaries, funds networks, stabilizes currency expectations, and tells domestic elites that the system still has a future. So when Iran reportedly linked reopening Hormuz to oil waivers, the message was not only about Lebanon. It was about cash. It was about survival space. It was about turning a maritime threat into a sanctions negotiation. That is why the Lebanon part is so important. Lebanon gives the demand a moral costume. Oil waivers give it the real body. Follow the money, then follow the fear. Iran's narrative says, stop the violence in Lebanon. Iran's demand says, give us room to sell oil. Iran's threat says, the world's energy artery is not safe if we are cornered. Those three messages are not identical. But they were pushed into the same frame, and that frame is what makes the move so explosive. Because once Tehran ties a humanitarian or security issue in Lebanon to the safe passage of global energy, it risks losing the moral high ground. It lets critics say Iran is not protecting Lebanon. It is using Lebanon as a bargaining chip. That is the harshest interpretation. But it cannot be dismissed. The strongest defense of Iran's position is also serious. You could argue that Iran is responding to Israeli military action in Lebanon, that Hezbollah is part of a regional deterrence architecture, and that Washington cannot ask Tehran to restrain allies while Israel keeps striking. That argument has weight. Smart people can believe it. If negotiations are about regional de-escalation, then Lebanon cannot be excluded. If Israeli operations continue, then Iran can argue there is no real ceasefire. If Hezbollah is under attack, Iran can argue that any deal ignoring Lebanon is fake stability. That is the best counter-argument. But it fails to explain one thing. Why Hormuz? Why take a Lebanon ceasefire dispute and attach it to a global shipping choke point? If the issue is Lebanon, pressure Israel diplomatically. If the issue is Hezbollah, negotiate security guarantees. If the issue is sanctions, negotiate waivers. But if the answer becomes Hormuz will not reopen, then the message changes. It no longer says only stop the war. It says the price of ignoring us may be global economic disruption. That is why the move is so dangerous. It transforms Iran from participant in a regional ceasefire debate into the state threatening the world's energy valve. And Washington understands the optics. That is why the U.S. response focused on navigation. Freedom of navigation is not just a maritime principle. It is a political weapon. It lets Washington frame Iran not as a wounded negotiator, but as a threat to the open system. The question is not what they said. The question is what they moved. Ships slowed. Oil prices jumped, then fell as talks appeared to progress. Military messaging hardened. Mediators rushed to keep the process alive. Lebanon, once a theater inside a larger regional conflict, became the hinge on which a U.S.-Iran deal could swing open or slam shut. Minus. That is the key. Iran may have wanted to enlarge the battlefield to gain leverage. But enlarging the battlefield also enlarges the number of people who can say no. Israel can say no through another strike. Hezbollah can say no through retaliation. Shipping companies can say no by delaying routes. Oil markets can say no through panic pricing. Washington can say no through military escort posture and sanctions pressure. Gulf states can say no privately through pressure on mediators. This is the hidden cost of linking everything. You create leverage, but you also create fragility. A negotiation with two parties is difficult. A negotiation with nuclear constraints, sanctions relief, oil exports, frozen assets, Israeli security demands, Hezbollah survival interests, Gulf mediation, Pakistani diplomacy, global energy flows, and shipping insurance is not just difficult. It is brittle. One crack travels everywhere. Now look at Israel's role. Israel's position, as reported, was that it needed the ability to keep acting against Hezbollah and maintain security in southern Lebanon. Hezbollah's position was that any ceasefire leaving Israel with freedom of action was unacceptable. Those are not small differences. Those are mutually hostile definitions of peace. For Israel, peace means removing the immediate Hezbollah threat and preserving the right to strike. For Hezbollah, peace means Israel leaving and losing the right to strike. For Iran, peace means protecting the credibility of its regional network. Minus. For Washington, peace means preventing Lebanon from detonating the larger deal. That is not one peace process. That is 4 different maps placed over the same territory. No wonder Hormuz became the pressure point. When a state cannot force agreement inside the conflict zone, it may try to create pain outside the conflict zone. That is what Hormuz does. It takes a military dispute in the Levant and exports anxiety to oil importers, tanker owners, insurers, and finance ministries. But that export of anxiety comes with risk. Because the moment Iran threatens Hormuz, countries that may not care deeply about Lebanon suddenly care deeply about Iran's behavior. Japan cares. South Korea cares. India cares. China cares. Europe cares. The Gulf cares. Every importer of oil and LNG cares. IEA data has shown that the majority of oil and product flows through Hormuz head to Asia, and that enormous LNG volumes from Qatar and the UAE also depend on the same passage. LNG is even harder because there is no easy alternate route for those volumes. That means Iran's threat is not aimed only at Washington. It splashes across Asia. Minus, and that is where the mistake becomes visible. Iran may believe it is pressuring the United States. But the countries most exposed to Hormuz disruption include states Iran may need as diplomatic buffers, oil buyers, or sanctions workarounds. A threat that touches everyone can isolate the person making it. This is the paradox of the choke point. The more powerful the threat, the more countries unite against its use. A knife on the table can win attention. A knife waved around the room can turn the room against you. Now pause there. Because the shipping data gives us the most honest version of the story. If Hormuz were fully closed, the world would see a hard rupture. If nothing happened, Iran's threat would be empty. But what we saw was something in between, enough slowdown to prove fear, enough continued traffic to let Washington deny control. That middle zone is perfect for psychological warfare, but terrible for trust. Negotiators can handle disagreement. They struggle with ambiguity designed to scare markets. That is why the big mistake is not that Iran talked about Lebanon. Lebanon is relevant. Lebanon is central to regional escalation. Lebanon cannot be magically removed from the equation. The mistake was tying Lebanon to Hormuz in a way that made global shipping feel like collateral. Because once that happens, even sympathetic listeners start asking a different question. Is Iran defending a ceasefire? Or monetizing a crisis? That is where the official story begins to crack. And we need to be careful here. The evidence does not prove Iran fully closed Hormuz. It does not prove every ship stopped. It does not prove every claim from Tehran was operational reality. But it does prove something strategically important. The claim mattered. Ships slowed. Markets reacted. Military statements intensified. Mediators had to manage safe passage. That means Iran did not need full closure to create pressure. It only needed credible fear. Credible fear is cheaper than war. But it is also unstable. Because credible fear must be refreshed. If Iran threatens and nothing happens, the threat weakens. If Iran escalates to prove credibility, the crisis can run beyond its control. That is the trap. Iran used ambiguity as leverage. But ambiguity demands maintenance. And every time Tehran maintains that ambiguity, it risks a miscalculation. A tanker captain makes a wrong call. A patrol boat moves too close. A drone is misread. A warning is ignored. An insurer pulls coverage. A government overreacts. Market panic creates political pressure. And then a sentence becomes a chain reaction. This is why the 60-day roadmap matters. 60 days sounds like structure. It sounds like time bought. It sounds like diplomats found a narrow bridge over a canyon. But a 60-day roadmap through Lebanon and Hormuz is not a bridge. It is a rope stretched between two fires. The deal must survive Israeli operations, Hezbollah discipline, Iranian domestic pressure, U.S. political threats, oil market volatility, and the credibility of Gulf mediation. That is a lot to ask from 60 days. Especially when the opening move was a threat to the world's most important energy choke point. Now let's talk about domestic pressure inside Iran. AP reported that Iran's president had voiced concern that people could take to the streets if authorities failed to satisfy them. That sentence matters because foreign policy is never only foreign. Every external threat has an internal audience. Iran's leadership needs to show strength abroad while easing pain at home. It needs to tell hardliners that it is not surrendering. It needs to tell economic actors that relief may come. It needs to tell regional allies that they are not being abandoned. That is a brutal balancing act. So Lebanon serves multiple purposes. It tells Hezbollah you are still inside the deal. It tells hardliners we did not trade away resistance. It tells Washington you cannot isolate the nuclear file from the regional file. It tells the domestic public we are forcing concessions, not begging for relief. But the problem with multi-audience messaging is that each audience hears a different promise. And later each audience demands payment. Hezbollah may demand protection. Hardliners may demand no retreat. Domestic citizens may demand economic relief. Washington may demand verification. Israel may demand freedom of action. Markets may demand safety. No single deal can satisfy all of that cleanly. That is why I call this the overloaded bargain. A normal bargain trades one concession for another. The overloaded bargain tries to solve too many crises with one diplomatic package. It looks powerful because everything is connected. It fails because everything is connected. In an overloaded bargain, every side brings its most painful issue to the table. Iran brings sanctions in Lebanon. Washington brings navigation and nuclear limits. Israel brings security. Hezbollah brings survival. Gulf states bring energy stability. Asian importers bring fear of disruption. The table becomes too heavy. On a mind, then someone asks why it collapsed. On a minds. It collapsed because the table was never designed to hold that much weight. This is where Iran may have miscalculated. Tehran may have believed that adding Lebanon increased leverage. But in an overloaded bargain, adding one more condition does not always increase leverage. Sometimes it increases the number of veto points. A veto point is a place where the deal can die. Lebanon is a veto point. Hormuz is a veto point. Oil waivers are a veto point. Israeli withdrawal is a veto point. Hezbollah restraint is a veto point. U.S. domestic politics is a veto point. Each new veto point gives someone else the power to destroy the deal. So the question becomes, who benefits from complexity? At first glance, Iran benefits. Complexity lets Iran say no progress is possible unless all fronts are addressed. It prevents Washington from isolating the nuclear file. It protects Hezbollah from being treated as a separate problem. But Washington also benefits from certain kinds of complexity. Because if Iran links Hormuz to Lebanon and oil waivers, Washington can tell allies, this is not just about sanctions relief. This is about whether Iran can threaten global commerce when negotiations get difficult. That strengthens the U.S. narrative. It makes Iran look like the unstable actor. And if shipping continues despite the threat, it lets Washington say Iran's leverage is weaker than advertised. That is a powerful counterframe. Iran says we can close the gate. America says the gate is open. Shipping data says the gate is open, but everyone is scared. And that third sentence is the one that matters. Because fear is not nothing. But fear is not control. This distinction may decide the next phase. If Iran truly controls Hormuz, then Washington must pay a high price to keep it open. If Iran only creates fear around Hormuz, then Washington can try to absorb the fear, prove passage, and reduce the threat's credibility. That is exactly why commercial traffic data becomes political ammunition. A tanker count becomes a battlefield. A barrel number becomes a message. A shipping lane becomes a courtroom where each side tries to prove the other is lying. This is modern geopolitics. Not just tanks. Not just missiles. Data flows, ship transponders, insurance rates, press briefings, oil futures, satellite tracks, and carefully leaked negotiation lines. Everyone is fighting to define reality before reality defines them. And Iran's Lebanon move gave everyone a new reality to fight over. There is another layer. Oil prices did not simply explode and stay there. Reuters reported that prices rose on threats and closure claims, then fell after talks ended with signs of progress and reports of waivers. That market movement is revealing. Markets were scared. Then markets recalibrated. That suggests traders saw risk, but not total rupture. They priced fear, then priced diplomacy. For Iran, that is both useful and dangerous. Useful because it proves the threat has market impact. Because it shows markets may not believe in an uncontrollable crisis yet. And if markets do not fully believe you, you face a choice. Accept, reduce leverage, or escalate to restore fear. Minds. That is the nightmare scenario. Not because Iran wants total war. States often do not want the catastrophes they walk toward. They want bargaining power. They want face saving. They want room to maneuver. They want the other side to blink. But the problem with threat diplomacy is that every threat creates an audience waiting to see if you mean it. Minus. If you do not act, you look weak. If you act, you may trigger the thing you were trying to avoid. Minus. This is the logic of the cliff. And Hormuz is the cliff. Now let's treat the counter-argument seriously. Maybe Iran did not make a mistake. Maybe Iran understood perfectly that Lebanon had to be included because any U.S.-Iran deal ignoring Hezbollah would be strategically fake. Maybe Tehran believed Israel would use any narrow nuclear deal to keep hammering Iranian allies while Washington claimed diplomacy was working. That is not a foolish argument. In fact, it is one of the strongest arguments for Iran's behavior. From Tehran's perspective, the nuclear file, sanctions, Lebanon, Israel, Iraq, Yemen, Syria, oil exports, and Iran pressure are not separate compartments. They are one security system. Western diplomats like separate files. Iran's regional strategy does not. So when Washington wants to discuss nuclear limits while Israel strikes Hezbollah, Iran can say, no, you do not get to divide the battlefield that you helped create. That argument has internal coherence. But it still runs into the Hormuz problem. Because including Lebanon in talks is one thing. Threatening the global energy artery over Lebanon is another. That jump is the vulnerability. It allows opponents to say Iran does not want a comprehensive peace. It wants a comprehensive hostage situation. That phrase may be unfair. But politics is not only about fairness. It is about frames. And Iran handed its opponents a frame they can weaponize. Here's the part they do not want to explain. If the Swiss talks were truly progressing toward a 60-day deal, why did Iran need the Hormuz threat at that exact moment? One answer is strength. Another answer is anxiety. Maybe Tehran wanted to lock in concessions before the process moved too far. Maybe it feared Lebanon would be sacrificed in a narrow nuclear bargain. Maybe it wanted oil waivers made explicit. Maybe it wanted to show hardliners at home that diplomacy was backed by pressure. All of those are plausible. But all of them point to the same conclusion. Iran did not trust the process enough to let the process work quietly. So it reached for Hormuz. And once it reached for Hormuz, the talks changed character. They were no longer simply negotiations. They became crisis management. That is a weaker position than it appears. A state with strong confidence in a negotiation does not need to create maximum external panic. A state that fears being cornered uses the one lever nobody can ignore. That does not make Iran irrational. It makes Iran exposed. There is a difference. Irrational actors are hard to read. Exposed actors are easier to pressure because you can see what they need. Iran needs sanctions relief. Iran needs oil revenue. Iran needs Hezbollah not to look abandoned. Iran needs domestic stability. Iran needs to show it can still impose costs. Iran needs the talks to produce something without looking like surrender. That is a lot of need. And need reduces leverage. This is the hidden weakness behind the dramatic threat. The louder Iran makes Hormuz, the clearer it becomes that oil waivers and regional guarantees are urgent. Washington can read that. Israel can read that. Markets can read that. Mediators can read that. Even Iran's partners can read that. And once everyone sees your urgency, they start negotiating against it. This is why the Lebanon move may become the big mistake. Not because Lebanon is irrelevant. Lebanon is very relevant. Not because Iran has no leverage. Iran has leverage. Not because Hormuz does not matter. Hormuz matters enormously. The mistake is that Iran connected its strongest threat to its most fragile dependency. It showed the world both the knife and the wound. The knife is Hormuz. The wound is economic pressure plus regional overextension. That is a dangerous combination. And Washington's strategy will likely be to separate them. The U.S. will try to keep Hormuz open, keep talks alive, demand restraint from Iran-linked actors, and avoid giving Tehran full credit for forcing concessions. It will frame any oil waiver as part of diplomacy, not a reward for maritime coercion. Iran will try to frame any concession as proof that resistance forced Washington to move. Israel will try to preserve freedom of action in Lebanon. Hezbollah will try to avoid looking like a pawn traded away in Switzerland. Qatar and Pakistan will try to keep the room from collapsing. And the market will watch every ship. That is the strange thing about this crisis. The next clue may not come from a speech. It may come from a tanker count. It may come from whether ships keep moving through Hormuz at normal volume. It may come from whether insurers raise risk premiums. It may come from whether another Israeli strike hits southern Lebanon. It may come from whether Hezbollah responds. The real battlefield is not just on the map. It is in the expectation of what happens next. Minus. That expectation is where Iran tried to apply pressure. But expectation can turn. If the world sees Iran as unable or unwilling to close Hormuz, the threat weakens. If the world sees Iran as willing to close it, Iran risks a broader coalition against it. That is the box. And Iran built part of that box itself. Now in the next 48 to 72 hours, watch three things. First, watch the shipping flow through Hormuz, not the speeches, the flow. If vessel traffic returns toward normal levels, Iran's closure threat loses bite. If traffic remains sharply reduced, the psychological blockade continues even without a full physical closure. Second, watch southern Lebanon. One major Israeli strike or one serious Hezbollah response can turn the ceasefire mechanism into paper ash. The talks can survive disagreement, but they may not survive proof that no one controls the battlefield. Third, watch the language around oil waivers. If Washington confirms waivers clearly, Iran can claim pressure worked. If Washington avoids confirmation or narrows the terms, Tehran may need another pressure signal to keep leverage alive. Those are the indicators. Not vibes. Not slogans. Concrete signals. Ships. Minus strikes. Waivers. Minus. That is where the truth will move. Because the public story will keep saying the same things. Diplomats will say progress, militaries will say readiness, markets will say risk, politicians will say strength, mediators will say talks continue. But beneath all of that, the question remains. Did Iran bring Lebanon into the talks to save its regional position? Or did it accidentally reveal that its regional position now depends on threatening a waterway it cannot fully afford to close? That is the question. And it matters because modern power is not measured only by how much damage you can threaten. It is measured by how much damage you can threaten without turning the room against you. Iran wanted to make Lebanon impossible to ignore. It succeeded. But in doing so, it may have made Iran impossible to trust. And that is the final trap. A country can enter negotiations with leverage. It can enter with anger. It can enter with demands. But when it enters by tying a regional war to the world's energy artery, everyone in the room begins to ask the same quiet question. Are we negotiating with a state seeking a deal? Or with a state showing us how expensive failure might become? And if diplomacy becomes indistinguishable from a warning shot, then what is peace? A settlement? A pause? Or just the moment before the next threat learns to speak louder?